This is the second of 3 lectures from Chapter 10, and the first lecture was on molecular geometry, and this lecture will cover how to determine the polarity of an entire molecule. There are 2 requirements for a molecule to be polar. Number 1, the molecule must contain polar bonds. You should know how to do that from the previous chapter. Determining polarity of bonds depends on the difference in electronegativity between the 2 atoms that are bonding, if you need a refresher. Most bonds are actually polar. In addition, for an entire molecule to be polar, it must have an unsymmetrical, or some people say asymmetrical, shape. In other words, if you have a molecule that is perfectly symmetric along all planes, it cannot be a polar molecule. Let's talk for just a minute about what we mean by polar. Polarity means there's uneven charge distribution. So for a molecule to be polar, that means the electron density is heavier, larger in one portion of the molecule than it is in another portion. And that sets up a dipole or partial charges. To give you a visual of a molecule that has polar bonds, let's look at carbon dioxide, CO2. If you draw the Lewis structure for carbon dioxide, and by the way, that's always the first step in determining whether or not a molecule is polar. You must draw the Lewis dot structure and determine its shape. That's the only way to figure out whether or not a molecule is symmetric or not. So again, back to carbon dioxide. The Lewis structure shows us that carbon dioxide is perfectly symmetric. It only has 2 areas of electron density around it, no lone pairs on the central atom, so it is linear. The individual carbon-oxygen bonds are quite polar. Oxygen attracts electrons more than carbon does, and so we have this partial charge distribution. So carbon dioxide does have polar bonds. However, because it is entirely symmetric, okay? So when I say entirely, I want you to look on the x and y axes for symmetry. So along the x-axis, if we draw a mirror right smack in the middle and then try to fold this molecule over on itself along the x-axis, it would fold perfectly over on itself. Perfect mirror image above and below the mirror. Now, if we were to do the same thing along the y-axis, we would still find perfect symmetry with carbon dioxide. So if you take the left-hand side of the mirror and you fold it over along the mirror on the right side, you'd have perfect overlap again. So CO2, because of its shape, is completely symmetric. So if you have a molecule that's totally symmetric, it is not polar. It doesn't matter anything else. It's not polar. Now, what that means when we say it's not polar is there's no separation of charge. There's no difference in electron density in one portion of the molecule overall. Net difference. So let's look at what that means. I've kind of messed up that figure, so let's look at this one. We have a dipole along each polar bond, but because of the molecular symmetry, we say that these dipoles cancel one another out because they're equal in intensity and opposite in charge. It's just kind of like vectors that you can add. So these 2 dipoles cancel each other out, and there's no net dipole, which when somebody says there's no dipole, they're saying it's not polar. Why do we care if a molecule is polar? It turns out that the polarity of a molecule affects all sorts of properties for that molecule, particularly melting boiling points and the solubility. That's very important. Solubility is very important for chemical reactions. Boiling points and melting points are important for how the material can be handled. So why does the polarity of a molecule affect these properties? If you imagine that a molecule is just this oval blob here, and we're assuming it's polar, which means we have some partial charge type separation. So we'll just say we have a partial negative charge on the right-hand side and partial positive charge on the left-hand side. Well, just kind of like a magnet. We know opposite charges attract, and so another one of these same molecules is going to come along. And how are these two molecules going to orient themselves around each other? They're going to orient themselves so the opposite charges are aligned. So something kind of like this, right? And because of that strict orientation, they're going to be the molecules going to be more resistant to being pulled apart, and that is exactly why the melting point and boiling point gets so high, because when you melt or boil something, you have to separate the individual molecules from each other. Also, as far as solubility goes, there is a saying, and we'll talk more about it in Gen Chem 2, that like dissolves like. What that means is that polar molecules dissolve in polar solvents, and nonpolar molecules dissolve in nonpolar solvents. The like dissolves like feature is probably most important for material solubility in water. Water is a polar molecule, so if you were to draw the structure of water, it's bent because it has two lone pairs on the central oxygen. And so there's an overall net polarity, oops, wrong way, in toward the oxygen, which is more electronegative. So water is quite polar. So water is going to dissolve other substances that are also polar. That's why ionic compounds, for example, almost always are very soluble in water. Think of table salt. Ionic compounds are the ultimate in polarity. They have full charge development, not even partial charge. That also explains why oil and water do not mix. Oil is simply made up of hydrocarbons of different lengths and molar masses. So you have this long chain carbon with just hydrogens attached, no other things. And I'm not sure if you heard me say this in class or if you were in class when I said it, but carbon-hydrogen bonds are always nonpolar. If you were to look on an electronegativity chart, you would find that I believe the electronegativity of carbon is 2.5, and I believe the electronegativity of hydrogen is 2. So the difference in electronegativity, I think hydrogen is 2.1. So the difference in electronegativity between a carbon and hydrogen is around 0.4, which puts it into the nonpolar bond region. So if a substance is a hydrocarbon, if all it's made up of is carbon and hydrogen, it's nonpolar. Symmetry doesn't matter. When all of the bonds are nonpolar, the molecule's nonpolar, period. Water, we just learned, is polar, and so oil and water won't mix. Like doesn't like unlike. Oh, that sounds kind of goofy. But anyway, that explains that phenomenon. This slide presents a visual for symmetric versus asymmetric molecules. So we just talked about carbon dioxide, and it is a symmetric molecule. So the dipoles cancel, and overall it is nonpolar. CO2 shows up a lot in these examples, so that's a good one to simply memorize too. Water, on the other hand, if you were to draw the correct Lewis structure, and which means that you would realize there are two lone pairs on the oxygen, doesn't have a linear structure, it has a bent structure. And because of that, water is not symmetric. So if we drew or put a mirror along the y-axis, it looks symmetric. You could fold one side over on the other. But remember, in order to determine total symmetry of a molecule, you have to look along the x and y axes. So if we were to put a mirror along the x-axis and fold the bottom up onto the top, it's not the same thing. It's not symmetric along that x-axis. So because of that, the dipoles don't cancel out in water, and overall it is a polar molecule. Here are the steps involved for predicting the polarity of a molecule. It is really tempting to take shortcuts. Please don't do it. I know this gets tedious. This is very likely going to be a free response type problem on your test. Please go through all these. You must be very careful and draw the correct Lewis structure. Drawing Lewis structures of molecules is probably the single most important thing you can study and prepare for in this test. Remember the steps. You start by counting the total number of valence electrons. You follow the rules in placing those valence electrons. First, give the outer atoms an octet. Put leftover electrons on the central atom. Remember then to look to see if all atoms have an octet. That's a step most people leave out. If the central atom does not have an octet, that's when you start making double and or triple bonds. Once you have the correct Lewis structure, you ask yourself whether or not the molecule is polar. There are two steps to determining whether or not a molecule is polar. Make sure there are some bonds in the molecule that are polar. Again, if all the bonds, for example, are carbon and hydrogen, it's nonpolar and you don't have to go any further. Most of the time, however, the bonds will be polar. If the bond is polar, then you move on to determine if the molecule overall is polar. That depends on symmetry. Okay? So if you have polar bonds, but the molecule is completely symmetric, it's nonpolar. Okay? If you have polar bonds and the molecule is not symmetric, in other words, if it's asymmetric, then the molecule is still polar. So spend some time with these steps, write them down, think about it, make sure they make sense and that you understand them. This is an important slide. Even if you were present for my lecture, I think it would be a really good idea. This is a great assortment of molecules, very representative of what you will probably see on your exam. And I want you to determine which of these molecules is polar and which is nonpolar. You must show all your work, which means number one, you must draw a Lewis structure of each of them. Then you must determine the shape of each of them. And on a test, I'd write this out more explicitly. And finally, you must determine the symmetry and the polarity of each molecule. Excellent practice here. Okay, it kind of covers everything we've learned in the last couple of chapters. So I would put the pre-recorded video on pause, try to go through these on your own, and then go to the next page to check your work. All right, I will briefly go over each one. Ammonia, NH3, if you draw the correct Lewis structure, has a lone pair on the central atom. In most cases, not in all cases, but in 90% or so of the cases, if you have one lone pair on the central atom, it will be a polar molecule. That one lone pair typically makes it asymmetric. So, do we have polar bonds? Yes, we do. Okay, you can either draw them show that with partial charges or with the dipole arrow. And although we have symmetry along the y-axis, there is no symmetry along the x-axis because on the top of the x-axis, we have a lone pair and on the bottom we have hydrogen atoms. So overall, NH3 is a polar molecule because it is not symmetric and it has polar bonds. Water has two lone pairs on the central atom. It has a bent shape. Bent shapes are not polar. Are not symmetric. I'll tell you that right now. So Again, if all you looked at was the y-axis, you might say, okay, yeah, there's symmetry there. But when you were to draw the x-axis, it is not symmetric. Therefore, water is polar, has polar bonds. The hydrogen-oxygen bond are polar. All right, so CH3Cl has tetrahedral shape. Tetrahedral shape, by the way, is a symmetric shape if all of the bonded atoms are identical. But because we have one chlorine and 3 hydrogens, there's a net dipole pointing toward the more electronegative chlorine. That kills the symmetry. It is not symmetric, so it is a polar molecule. And I am realizing that if you were in class last week, we talked about CH2Cl2, and I believe in class that I said it was nonpolar, which I attribute to my ignorance and also my difficulty in seeing three-dimensional. So I just looked it up, and it is, in fact, polar. You may, well, I'm not going to tell you the wrong thing like I did before, but the bottom line is if you make this model, which I had to do three-dimensionally, there is no way that you can get it to be totally symmetric. There is a net dipole that goes toward the more electronegative chlorine atoms, and overall it's polar. But since I messed you up on that, I'm not going to give you anything similar to CH2Cl2 on the test in case I imprinted or stamped the wrong information. So I apologize for that. The last one is xenon tetrafluoride. If you were to draw the Lewis structure, it actually has 6 regions of electron density, which gives it an octahedral electron domain shape. But because you have 2 lone pairs and you ignore those lone pairs for the molecular shape, we are now dealing with a square planar molecular shape, which now is totally symmetric because all of these bonded atoms are the same. And so even though the xenon fluorine bonds are extremely polar, all of the dipoles cancel, and overall it's a nonpolar molecule. That's it for molecular polarity.